Hi, my name is Ernesto and I'm a marriage and family therapist. I'm here with Dan Drake. He's also a marriage and family therapist, but he is a certified sex addiction therapist. Now, when we think about sex addiction, there's a lot of misconception about sex addiction in general. Our society talks about it, our culture talks about it, but nobody really understands so much about it. So today we're just going to have a clarification on what it is from Dan. So Dan, go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit and some of the things that you do.
Sure. Well, thanks, Ernesto, and thanks for asking me to do this. And you're so right. I think there's just such a misconception when it comes to sex addiction. You got the media on one end saying it's a real thing, and on the other end you've got movies and TV, and it becomes this joke. There's actually been a lot of articles. Newsweek, Time have actually been doing a lot of recent articles on sex addiction. So I think it was even a front page of even Newsweek. I could be wrong about that. I got to read some of the article, but only in passing. So as it was passed around. So yeah, I'm a certified, or I'm completing my certification to be a certified sex addiction therapist. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I work primarily with sex addicts, their partners, and their families at the Institute for Sexual Health in Beverly Hills, California, as well as in private practice in Studio City, California.
Great.
So yeah, and I've been doing this. And in addition, just something I wanted to also say is, in addition to my professional experience in this area, I've been in my own personal recovery from sex addiction. So, I'm hoping today to just share some of my experience professionally and personally, and hopefully to share what is sex addiction, how does it impact people, and what do you do about this thing?
Definitely. So, Dan, let me just ask you then, in general, what is the actual definition of a sex addiction? So let's say someone's coming up to me and says, hey, my husband or a friend of mine is struggling with sex addiction. What is it that constitutes someone that's struggling with this addiction?
Yeah, well, more generally, I mean, a general way of understanding it is a phenomenon in which someone loses control over one or more elements of their sexuality, and that leads to consequences. It impacts them for themselves or for their relationships. So that's a general understanding, but one definition I like to give is that sex addiction is a pathological relationship to a mood-altering experience. Again, pathological relationship to a mood-altering experience. And we can unpack that as well.
Right.
And one thing that I want to start with understanding that definition is really saying that we as human beings, in my belief, are created for connection. I think that we're wired to be in relationship with other human beings. Mm-hmm. And for most of us, we end up in relationships, and with our parents and our primary caregivers, they did a good enough job. We got most of our needs met from them. They did a good enough job to raise us. And nobody's perfect, no family's perfect. Right. So that's not an expectation. And at the same time, whether it's through abuse or through trauma, or maybe just some vulnerabilities that someone has in their own personality or temperament, sometimes that need for relationship or that connection with other human beings can actually get messed up, where an individual maybe doesn't get their needs met in the way that they could or should, or needs to get them met. Right. So in those cases, that individual might even, they're still wired for relationship, they're still wired for connection. So if they now don't trust human beings, and human beings have let them down or haven't met their needs, they will turn to something to meet their needs.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt you. I do appreciate the fact that you're saying that this type of addiction is rooted in relationships, and it's a pathological, I guess, morphed into a pathological issue in the context of relationships.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it becomes, because sex or our sexuality is so deeply relational. But I want to say that it starts usually from a young age, where maybe something goes wrong with that connection with other human beings, and so someone will turn to a thing. And I think maybe the easiest way of understanding is just a quick illustration, or an example. So let's say you have a 13-year-old boy whose father has been, maybe father left, so not around, mom's working a couple jobs, so really not around, a single parent trying to take care of a kid. Maybe, let's say there's some other men coming in and out of the house that the mom has, coming in and out of the house. Maybe some of them are abusive to this kid. So this 13-year-old has some issues potentially at this point with abandonment, loss, rejection. Um, and in that case, maybe he also is a shy kid or doesn't have the ability to connect with other kids, peers his own age. He's a little awkward or whatever.
Right.
That kid, maybe he discovers alcohol. He sees his peers that are using alcohol, drinking, and he finds, oh, if I drink, I can fit in. But he quickly finds out that alcohol actually not only lets him fit in, that he's actually wanting to connect with those kids, but he now forms a relationship with alcohol where he feels better when he drinks. Maybe he doesn't feel quite the same pain. Maybe, it just loosens him up. Over time, that relationship that now he's formed with alcohol can become unhealthy, where maybe when it first had him trying to connect with other people, because that's what he really wanted, at some point he's like, I really don't need those other people. All I really need is that alcohol to make me feel better, to make me even be numb and not have those feelings. And I think that's a more common, so that example is more common that we can see, oh yeah, we get that for alcoholism. But the same thing really applies for sex addiction. So let's say there's this 13-year-old kid who, instead of alcohol or some sort of chemical, he finds that instead of those things, I find masturbation, I find pornography. So instead of turning to alcohol or a chemical, he's like, oh yeah, for a second, I've got anyone available at whatever time I want.
Right.
It feels good for a second, and they're always waiting, and he doesn't have to really force himself to be in connection with other human beings on a real level. That there's that safety, that protection against abandonment and rejection, that there's pretty much anything out there for him available with pornography and masturbation.
And early on, you mentioned that our society is so sexualized, and another piece of that is that it's so pornography, any sexual materials, or it's so accessible in our society nowadays because it's so sexualized, and you have shows on MTV or even other media outlet that really emphasizes on this idea of sex, and so it makes it very accessible for a 13-year-old, even younger.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. In the age of, they've done studies on the age of when kids are sexualized or exposed to some sort of sexual material, and it used to be teenage, maybe a little bit younger, but somewhere around teenage. Now it's way younger. I mean, the age that we're sexualized is so much younger, and yet there's so much sexuality out there, but yet we're really not taught or told what is sex, or what is healthy relationship, or what is intimacy. I mean, these things are so foreign.
Hi, my name is Ernesto, and I'm a marriage and family therapist. I have with me Dan Drake. He is also a marriage and family therapist, but he's working towards being certified as a sex addiction therapist. So, the first segment of our discussion, we talked a little bit about what the culture believes or thinks about sex addiction. There's a lot of jokes about it. There's a lot of misconception about it in our culture. So today, our discussion is going to be the criteria for sex addiction, the treatment for it, and also some of the help and resources that people who struggle with sex addiction can have as far as their resources. So again, this is Dan Drake. Dan, hello.
Hey, Ernesto.
All right. And I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna introduce myself again real quick, but
yes, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Dan Drake, I'm a marriage and family therapist, and like you said, I'm completing my certification as a certified sex addiction therapist. And you're so right, and it's just this recently has been in the Newsweek article. Front page is on sex addiction, the new epidemic. So this is a current topic, and it's debated. There's other periodicals, like in the psychology field, there's a lot of people debating this. So there's misconceptions not only in our society, what we understand all of us understand, but then even in the professionals. So really trying to understand that at the root of sex addiction is pain, and we spent a lot of time talking about what's this all about, and why would this be an addiction, unlike or actually very similar to chemical addiction or some sort of drug or alcohol addiction, where it's a chemical ingested in your body. Now sex addiction's in your head. So today we wanted to talk a little bit more about okay, so that's the general, but what is this thing? How would we identify this? What are the criteria or characteristics?
Okay.
Yeah. And different people have written about 10 different characteristics of sex addiction. And I think if you really understand these top three, you can really understand all 10.
Okay.
So why don't we just dive into those?
Let's do that. Okay.
Okay. So the first characteristic of sex addiction is a loss of control over the activity. And that's pretty common for any compulsion or any addiction.
Mm.
So, and that could be you lose control over the amount of time you're engaging in that activity, or maybe you've crossed lines into a behavior you never thought you would.
Right.
So it's not uncommon. I'll hear all the time for people, there's efforts to stop. They maybe, okay, I promised themselves they wouldn't do this behavior anymore, but then yet they continue to do the behavior. Inevitably, they end up doing it. Or they put a line in the sand, I won't do such and such behavior,
Right.
only to find out that they will, ultimately do it. So there's an escalation that's involved in this loss of control.
Right, and also I do want to make an input on this. So the loss of control over activity. I remember having a client who, at some point, was looking at pornography, and
Hmm.
he graduated, if you will, to looking for prostitute, even 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning, just trying to get that fix. So, his relationship started falling apart, and finally he started getting write-ups at work. And so this is how, I guess, what you're saying, in the very one of the criterias of it is the loss of control over activities, which is
Yeah, right.
absolutely
And
true.
what you talked about was some of both of what the next one is as well. We'll talk about that, the continuation despite negative consequences.
Right.
But yeah, you're right that a lot of times, okay, I'm doing this online, but I'm not going to engage in these behaviors in quote real life. And yet you might find that these do cross over from the internet or cyber
Right.
internet-based behaviors into reality. Or you could find maybe you'll see this control, this pattern of losing control over time, where maybe when you first start looking on the internet at pornography, it's images and you're satisfied with that, but soon enough that's not going to be enough. Where now
Right.
you need videos, maybe more risky or taboo or extreme behaviors, maybe even getting to the point of illegal behaviors.
Right.
So that's important. It can be confusing for someone that now they're engaging in things they never thought they would.
Right.
But if you understand that, again, you're addicted to those chemicals in your brain, that you need more and more of a hit, you need more intensity or more longer periods of time, or you need more and more to get the same amount of feeling,
Right.
so, or the experience.
Right.
So,
Good.
so that's the first one. And then you really talked about the second one, is continuation of the behavior despite the negative consequences. So again, first is loss of control. This one's continuation despite negative consequences. So losing jobs, or there's all kinds of consequences for sex addiction. Could be relationship, could maybe a separation or a divorce that's
Right.
pending. Could be financial consequences. I've heard people spending their kids' college tuition on
That's
sexual
amazing.
behaviors. And even if they know these things or illegal activities, maybe they're on parole or something for actually being arrested for something, for a behavior they're engaging in. At some point, even though they know that, they'll still engage in the behaviors.
Right.
So, most of us think, okay, well, you have these consequences, so that should be enough to stop you. Well, if it's really an addictive behavior, at some point, those consequences aren't fully good enough. Like,
Yeah, and I think that's
you,
the ugliness of sexual addiction, because it, unfortunately, it affects everybody in the family. For marriage, I've seen it break apart relationships, divorce, separation. I mean, families are definitely affected by this, and
yeah.
the addiction part comes in where it seems like they don't care. The person that's engaging in this type of behaviors, they don't really care how it affects everybody else. They just keep going no matter what the consequences may be.
Well, and that's a really important point. And I don't know if I would say that they don't care. They actually really, really do care about their partners, wives, family. There's one part of them that deeply loves and is completely attached to their partners,
Right.
and yet they're engaging in this. And that's why this isn't just that guy that's going out there and having all the women and
Right.
having a good time and saying, I don't care. Like, that can be part of it for some people, but for many, they actually really do love their families, and they find themselves doing these things they can't stop.
Right.
So that even knowing that it's hurting their families, it's